Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin T-Weld. For our Chinese-speaking audience, 欢迎收听道可道中国哲学播客. Okay, so we're joining you at 6:30 a.m. Hong Kong time, 6:30 p.m. in South Bend, Indiana, where Richard is. And it's basically the end of the summer, the beginning of the fall in 2025. Today, we're finally going to address a topic that, for those of you who want to understand the Chinese philosophical tradition in historical context, is probably considered essential. So for a long time, you might say that in some sense, this debate that we're going to discuss today, which is a debate about big, elaborate, extravagant public performances of music, was definitive of both Confucianism and Mohism, two rival schools of thought, two rival philosophical traditions in ancient China. Both the Confucians and the Mohists sort of defined themselves. They understood themselves as being in opposition to the other on this issue. It was sort of a hot button issue. And that's because the Mohists largely saw big public performances of music as wasteful, an extravagance that rulers at the time couldn't afford without sacrificing more valuable goods like food and shelter for their people. Whereas the Confucians just thought that musical performances were so essential in various ways for community building, for personal cultivation, for the kind of refinement and development and cultivation of people's emotional dispositions, their temperament, and so on, that Confucians thought it was justified. So that's going to be our topic today. But first, I suppose we should just sort of catch up. Is that right, Richard?
Yeah, I actually think an apt topic for us to catch up on is what kind of music we both listen to. I'm curious, Justin. I actually have no clue what kind of music you're into. I don't think we've ever talked about it, but I would like to hear about that.
Okay, yeah. I always feel like a bit of a stereotype when I say it, but there's so much you can know about my taste in music just by knowing my age and where I grew up and my kind of demographic. So anyway, I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is in the middle of the country. And it's not a big city, but I grew up there in the late 80s, early 90s. And to make a long story short, if you were someone who was interested in education and the arts and that kind of stuff back then you lived at a time when people sort of defined themselves by their music. I would say basically to ask someone when I was 16, 17, 18, to ask me what taste in music I had was essentially to ask me about my subcultural identity, you know? So this wasn't just true for me, but I think it was true all over the US for a lot of youth. The people who listen to country music belong to a certain subculture. The people who listen to heavy metal music belong to a certain subculture. So I listened to what they then called alternative music, or indie rock, independent music. So we were sort of the counter-cultural group. And moreover, back in that era, if you were into independent music, you're very proud of your local bands. You sort of didn't want really corporate popular music that was, we always worried it was a little too uniform and lacking in creativity. Yeah, so I had a bunch of bands that I listened to. I mean, there's a kind of trajectory. My father especially convinced me to listen to a lot of political music from the 60s. That was kind of my earliest musical awakening. But then when I came into my own, the era of like U2 and REM, to name some mainstream bands, I listened to those more mainstream alternative bands like U2 and REM, but also a lot of local bands that most people won't have heard of. There was someone from Omaha, Nebraska called Tim Kasher. There was a very popular band among us Nebraska kids called Bright Eyes. They're still going. So anyway, because that independent music was so much a part of our waking life and because music is so powerful in general, I'd say it's been basically an evolving part of my life ever since. So just as when I was 16, 17, so too today am I constantly picking up new tastes in music and kind of listening to music in this genre, independent music, and also nearby genres and getting excited about it. And I still remember when I was in college, I would often hear music that was really great and feel like I was in some ways transcending, And that still happens, not as much, but
do you attend concerts or live events?
Yeah, it's still a major part of my life. And moreover, it's one of the things that I have in common with my spouse, my partner. My view about some people like to think that their partner is their soulmate in every respect. I don't think that's actually a good thing. I think it's good to have different interests in some respects, but it's good to have some common interests. And without a question, Melanie and I both love live music. So we end up seeing, I don't know, 6 or 7, maybe even more live shows every year.
Mm.
So we still have evolving tastes. I rely on her a lot. She's often the one calling my attention to new music and sharing it with me. We have a shared, music account and that kind of thing.
So, and it's still very much local, small, like indie bands that you're into?
Yeah, so I follow some of the indie bands that are from Nebraska still. There's a music label called Saddle Creek Records, but it's still indie bands. So if you want to know the songs that I happen to be listening to again and again these days, one of them is by Cat Powers called Metal Heart. It's an old one, but there have been reinterpretations of it by other musicians. Another one is Gillian Welch, a kind of folk singer. She wrote this beautiful song about her youth, looking back on it retrospectively, called Wrecking Ball. So yeah, that's the stuff I listen to.
I bet you'll get some emails from someone like, hey, that's my favorite.
Yeah.
Yeah, there'll be someone out there.
I hope so, yeah. But I feel bad mentioning it because I know that if you're from my generation, it's a little insufferable, actually, the way some people who are kind of music snobs will tell you must listen to some obscure band that you've never heard of. And it bothers me too, but it's also just how I live. I mean, music is so much a part of my life, and it's so important to me to not just to get stuck in the same old ruts, but to discover new music,
So you were never into, like, Green Day is a kind of alternative band that everyone knows about and very famous, or like Everclear, right? Live.
Yeah.
Collective Soul. I remember these bands sort of around that time, I think.
I remember liking Green Day in college, and it never enough to buy the album. And Everclear sounds familiar, but I can't recall it. And I'm embarrassed to say there are major musicians these days that I'm sure I've overheard, at like in public spaces, but I didn't knowingly overhear them. So, for example, Taylor Swift is probably the most popular musician on the planet right now. I don't know.
Probably, actually.
Yeah. And I can't say I've ever heard a song by Taylor Swift.
So you don't know the name of a single song by Taylor Swift?
Well, a friend of mine encouraged me to hear the Screaming Females cover of Shake It Off. Is that a Taylor Swift song?
Yes, that is a Taylor Swift song. Yes.
Yeah.
A little bit older, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I've heard someone else's, an indie rock band's interpretation of one of her songs. Yeah. That's closest I can come. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's really good. I think maybe we'll balance things out because I have such a uncultivated taste in music. I think I was just into very popular stuff. So I guess I'm listening to music in middle school, or really starting in middle school. I remember like Hootie and the Blowfish.
Oh, yeah.
And Blues Traveler. I kind of like them. Yeah. Run Around and Hook. Yeah. They had these kind of famous songs because it would just come on the radio. So I listened to just kind of some of the popular stuff. I remember certain kind of like rappers that were popular, like Notorious B.I.G. and Puff Daddy, although Puff Daddy has gotten into some trouble in recent years, and Tupac. Although I guess I did also listen to a fair bit of Korean music in middle school and also high school. So this is before it was really that popular globally. So these are old Korean bands that no one would have heard of, like Cool and H.O.T. and no one would know of this stuff either. But I was listening to a lot of that.
When this show was still just kind of a figment in our imaginations and we were thinking idly about starting it, you mentioned that there might be some good intro music from a Korean hip-hop band, I remember.
Yes, Drunken Tiger. Yes.
Drunken Tiger.
Yeah, they were two rappers, and they had some really interesting beats. And I don't know if they're still active, but they were very popular in the 90s. Yeah, so I listened to a fair bit of that. I did always try to develop like a broader range. Like would try to listen to some classical music, Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky and Chopin. And also
you sometimes mention jazz.
Yeah, jazz. Yeah. So in the recent, maybe I would say 5-10 years, I tried to get into some important, jazz musicians like Sonny Rollins.
Oh, yeah.
I really came to think he's amazing. And, John Coltrane and, of course, Miles Davis. But I don't know if I'm definitely no expert, but I think it's good to have like a broad range. And I guess one beautiful thing about living in today's society, though, is music is so accessible, right? And so cheap. Like I have YouTube Music now. I don't know if you have that, but you can just get almost, I don't know. I do wonder if the kind of music you listen to would be on there as well. But for me, I mean, everything's on there, including Korean music. and including the lyrics. So like I was kind of blown away because in recent year or two, they would now include all the Korean lyrics to these songs from the 90s and the 2000s. Yeah, and it would appear on YouTube Music. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I admit I like to. I mean, to this day, I still like reading the lyrics sometimes as I'm listening and puzzling over them. And I like songs that are sort of elusive. They seem to be capturing a sentiment that is familiar to me and to many others, even though you can't quite put your finger on it and characterize it.
Well, the most recent song I've been listening to for some reason over and over, which because of my oldest daughter, somehow she got into this song by, John Denver.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Very famous.
Grew up on John Denver. Yeah.
Yeah, Rocky Mountain High. But the song that I've come to just love is Country Road, Take Me Home.
Yes.
Do you know that one?
Yep, I do.
And I don't know. That song, it just has this kind of nostalgic element. The first line is something like West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains.
Yeah.
But of course, I've never been to West Virginia. But somehow I kind of think of West Virginia as whatever kind of home that I kind of miss or the memories of the place I used to live in. Like for me, it would be like Los Angeles, actually. I actually was listening to the song and I read some YouTube comments. There was some guy who posted saying, and it got like so many likes. And he said, I live in Mumbai, India. And I love this song, and I've never stepped a foot in America ever. But I feel like I know West Virginia, in a sense, like whatever his hometown is. Yeah, I thought that comment was just really beautiful because it shows the transcendent power of music.
Absolutely, yeah. You can imbue a place that the listener's never been to with a sense of nostalgia, sentimentality, and such, so that people who've never stepped foot in the U.S., not to mention West Virginia, can feel like somehow it must be a really homey, sentimental place that elicits powerful memories, even though it can't elicit powerful memories for them. They've never seen it. Country music in particular has that kind of power, I think. Well, that's great. And you sell yourself a little short, Richard, in saying that you just have popular tastes. As long as I've known you, it seems like you've always been working on cultivating some new taste in music. Most recently, it's been jazz. In some sense, that's more adventurous than what I do, I'm always listening to new musicians and new songs, and the genre that I like seems to be, by definition, self-evolving or something. Still, I think it's not quite as adventurous as what you do.
Now, I think it often just comes up like when I watch some other movie or someone suggests like how beautiful jazz is, or like I was watching that movie Whiplash. I don't know if you know this. It's a really interesting movie about a drummer. Anyways, he's trying to imitate this very famous drummer named Buddy Rich. I don't know if you've ever heard of Buddy Rich, but he's supposed to be this, legendary drummer. And I started listening to him and realized how amazing he is. Yeah, so I would kind of get into it, but I'll be honest with you, 90% of the time, I'm listening to old songs that I've heard like 1,000 times. That's usually what I do.
I see. Well, I'm glad you asked this question, Richard. It's sort of the untold story behind a lot of people's work, I think. It seems to me that a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about their music. It means a lot to them, and yet they don't often talk about it. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but back in my day, there weren't people walking around with earbuds listening to music day and night. So generally, when they listen to music, they listened with friends and they talked about it. And so their tastes in music were a little bit more public, a little bit more outward facing. Now it's private. Just talking with you now, for the first time, I've realized that to a certain extent, people's influences have gone underground, and it's harder to know what their thoughts are dwelling on and what moves them, simply because everyone listens to their own music so privately now.
Yeah, I guess we should move on and kind of introduce the topic. So today we're talking about this really fascinating, interesting debate between the Mohists and the Confucians. So some of our listeners probably aren't familiar with the Mohists. They lived roughly around the time of the early Confucians like Mencius or Mengzi and Xunzi during the Warring States period, roughly between 5th to 3rd century BCE. And the Mohists are often considered as the first consequentialist and thought that we should maximize a set of goods like, according to them, population, wealth, and social order. And as we've discussed in the past, they affirm an impartial view of morality that rejects the kind of differentiated care that the Confucians affirm. Other disagreements with Confucians include importance of character formation or virtue cultivation, the value of ritual, and of course, our topic for today, the value of music.
Yeah, that's right. So that's what we will discuss after the interlude. Okay, welcome back. So our topic today is the great debate between Mohists and Confucians about musical performances. And let me just give you a little bit of historical context. So this is the Warring States period. Really, the texts that we're going to read are probably from the 4th to 3rd century BCE, which is the Warring States period, kind of peak Warring States, that is to say, a time of a lot of disorder, warfare, and so on, and a difficult time for the people, I think. And the stakes, essentially, as I see it, between the Mohists and the Confucians are competing visions of governance and human flourishing. So it's both the Mohists and the Confucians would agree that their account, their vision of good governance, good social order depends on the success to a certain degree of their arguments about musical performances. And they also think that, at least the Confucians are quite clear, that their views about musical performances have direct implications for what it means to flourish or succeed as a human being, to be well, to be well off. So that's going to be the issue. Let me just tell you a little bit about the Mohists. So the Mohists themselves, oftentimes it's spelled Mohists. That refers to the school of thought that aligns itself with Mozi, Mozi. Mozi is understood as, we mentioned earlier, a consequentialist philosopher, but he's also sometimes characterized as a utilitarian. And here I have to ask my philosophy friends and colleagues to shut off that part of their brain which immediately applies the template from normative ethics and 20th, 21st century philosophy when they hear that word utilitarian, and use it instead in the old-fashioned, not so philosophical sense that, I don't know, you sometimes see in like turn-of-the-century British novels or something. Utilitarian in this other sense that we have in English sometimes just refers to something that's functional, where the value of the thing is functional and not, I don't know, aesthetic. So if you have a utilitarian house or a utilitarian car, that means it does its job. It like protects you from the elements if it's a house. It gets you to a destination if it's a car, but it's not beautiful. It's not flashy. Mohists are thought to be utilitarians in that sense too. So that helps to explain why they are so motivated to take these expensive, elaborate musical performances out of the court and thus out of the kind of economic system that they think it does so much damage to. And then they're known as being a little bit less pro-ritual than the Confucians. So it's not exactly that they're anti-ritualistic. They still believe in mourning and weddings and so on, but they don't think the rituals need to be so elaborate that they need to take up so much time and consume so many resources. So that's kind of where the Mohists are coming from. The Confucians, by contrast, are often said to be better able to, or at least more open to this idea of that there's a certain kinds of aesthetic value, appreciation of beauty, beautiful experiences, and so on, that they're open to. And they're certainly stronger, more emphatic advocates of ritual. So that's a very brief description of the two camps. Our featured Confucian is going to be Xunzi, Xunzi, one of the great defenders of ritual, who also happened to write a treatise defending musical performances over and against the Mohists' objections. One other thing I might mention about the two schools of thought is that, I don't know, some people find this helpful. If you read any of the Chinese scholarship, especially from the latter half of the 20th century, you'll see a lot of kind of class analysis. This is really the sort of stuff that you see coming out of the People's Republic of China, mainland China, when class analysis was popular. And it was often said that Confucianism was the school or the tradition that defended the kind of the sure class, the scholar official class, or more often the feudal class, the class of the feudal lords. So if you want to give a kind of an account of what their motivations were, it was to defend the interests of those classes. Whereas sometimes it was said back then that the Mohists reflected the interests of the artisan class, the people who labor with their hands, And I don't know if that's helpful or not. I think sometimes that distorts the picture of the two schools of thought. But anyway, that's something that you'll sometimes see in scholarship on these two schools of thought.
So I actually had never heard of that. So the PRC invoked actual Mohist ideas. They would cite the texts of Mozi.
No, okay. So as I understand it, Mao did find something very appealing in Mozi, Chairman Mao. What I meant was that, so for example, I myself, did a lot of my early training in Chinese philosophy in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And back then, if you went to China to study with someone who was a specialist in Chinese intellectual history and philosophy, you'd probably read Li Zihe, who was a kind of popular intellectual historian and philosopher at the time. And his writing was, as I recall, suffused with this kind of class analysis. So he would often start by, when he introduced a new thinker, whether it was a classical thinker like Confucius or Xunzi or Mozi, or even a more recent one, like Juxi or Daizhen or something, with an account of what class he was from, where that sort of Marxist way of accounting for someone's ideology. It was influential for a long time, and it still is. And I think maybe in the case of, sometimes it's not very enlightening, I think, to read a philosopher that way. But maybe in the case of the Mohists, it is. I mean, there are ways in which the Mohists, I think, do seem to speak for this class that's sort of the artisan class is not exactly one that's completely without education, but they have skills, right? But they are definitely not an elite. They don't have a lot of influence. And there are ways in which you can interpret their core doctrines as representing the interests and worldview that people in that position might have. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I see. So they were using a kind of Marxist lens to kind of think through the different traditions. And they're using, I think we mentioned this idea of the hermeneutics of suspicion. What you're doing is you're trying to identify the real or the hidden motivations that's kind of driving the project. So those who defend Confucianism, of course, they're the literati, the scholars, because, then they're able to sustain their power. And so, so that would be the way that I guess people during that era would read these texts rather than employing what is sometimes called hermeneutics of faith, where you're really trying to take them at their word and see the truth value in their arguments and evaluate them in a kind of a charitable manner and so on.
Yeah, that's right. And we've mentioned this in past episodes. As a philosopher, I only have so much patience with the hermeneutics of suspicion. I think there's so much of that goes on just in ordinary conversation, and that our minds quickly go to that kind of analysis of people's arguments and views, that we really need as philosophers to kind of set it aside now and then and try to take the arguments seriously, take them at face value as truth claims. And so I try to do that too, even with the Mohists, but I just mentioned this characterization of the Mohists as the spokespeople for the artisan class simply because it's heuristically useful. Like if you're looking for some succinct way of describing what their worldview is like, it might actually be useful to bear in mind that the sorts of doctrines that they advocate for are the ones that you might expect of people who come out of this artisan class. People who aren't themselves elites, right? But have this kind of skilled labor that they can provide and have some access to education. Yeah.
Yeah, they kind of represent the working class, the people. Okay, they're more appealing to, I guess, people with kind of more Marxist orientation. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, of course, unlike the Marxists, the Mohists did believe in a fairly hierarchical social structure, just like the Confucians.
Yes.
They recommend obeying one's superior. That's, I think, the title of a chapter. And they recommend highly centralized, a fairly authoritarian government. And but, they also show some signs of being more egalitarian in style in the sense that they do want their arguments to be accessible more generally to people. They believe that there's these common standards of arguments that ordinary people can understand. Like, I think, so there's three, right? Like historical precedent, what the Sage Kings did, but also like common experience and I think practical consequences, whether a certain argument or a doctrine leads to practical benefits as they saw them. And so I guess Mohists would have criticized the Confucians as requiring too much, I don't know, maybe like a technical education or a highfalutin kind of training before being able to understand or grasp the Confucian form of life. Whereas I suppose the Mohists would have took some pride in saying, hey, you don't have to go through schooling for years upon years. Look, we have these great arguments and a way of life that even ordinary folks, the farmer or the person on the street, can easily recognize as compelling. So I suppose they would have thought that in that way, they had kind of an edge over the Confucians.
Yeah, that is a subtle point, Richard, but a really good one as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, both the Confucians and the Mohists recommend social and political structures that are hierarchical. There's no doubt. The Mohists are very clear. The chapter you mentioned is one where they say essentially that there are these norms that are sort of imposed upon people by their superiors, and each person is supposed to more or less obey orders and conform to the norms as given to them by their superiors and so on. So the Mohists are not egalitarian in terms of the social structure that they recommend. But one way in which they really do arguably stand apart from Confucians, at least some Confucians, is in that they seem to be committed to this idea that when you're making a philosophical argument, the justifications for your views should bottom out, essentially in arguments that even ordinary people can assess and appreciate. Mm-hmm. And that's why they're so adamant about establishing these three success criteria. It's hard to articulate exactly how egalitarian Mohist justification is, Mohist epistemology is. And Loy has one of those very subtle articles, kind of difficult actually, I think, for non-philosophers, but I find excellent at distinguishing the senses in which Mohist epistemology is and is not egalitarian. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's worth, just as a kind of impressionistic claim, it's worth pointing out, because there are some Confucians who make this move, including this guy that we're going to discuss today, Xunzi, who say more or less, there are certain claims about value, about the way, that I can't necessarily position you as an ordinary person to assess with any reliability. You just have to immerse yourself in the Confucian way and become an expert at it in order to appreciate what's good about it, in order to see its value. And you even see in the Mozi some complaints about Confucians behaving that way. So you get the impression that that move, that kind of a tendency to, in their epistemology, pull rank or invoke their authority, their expertise, annoys the Mohists, Yeah, I like the observation. Mm-hmm. All right. And maybe that'll come up today as we discuss the core question, the core topic of our debate, which is, are these big public musical performances a wasteful extravagance or a vital tool for moral and social order? And we have three passages we're going to read and discuss. One of them is the lasting, influential condemnation of musical performances that comes from the Mozi. This is a chapter that's very well known. We'll start with that one first. Then we're going to move on to this classical Confucian Xunzi, his response to the Mohists. And then finally, we're going to read a later debate between an unnamed Confucian and Mozi himself, as recorded in a lesser-known chapter of the Mozi. All right, so the first passage is from chapter 32 of the Mozi, the chapter which is called A Condemnation of Musical Performances, or A Condemnation of Music. And I'll read this one. So our teacher Mozi says, "The benevolent surely are those who devote themselves to finding ways to promote what is beneficial to the world while eliminating what is harmful." Okay, so it starts out with a definition of people who are benevolent. Who are these benevolent people? Well, they're the people who devote themselves to finding ways to promote what is beneficial to the world while eliminating what is harmful. This is why they are proper models for human conduct throughout the world. If something benefits the world, then they will do it. If it does not benefit the world, then they will stop doing it. Moreover, when the benevolent think about the people of the world, if there is something that attracts their eyes, delights their ears, pleases their palates, and gives comfort to their bodies, but this thing can only be gotten by sacrificing the people's stock of food and clothing, they will not engage in it. Okay, so this is the beginning of, in fact, a much longer chapter. We're not going to read it all because we get lost in the details. But I think you've heard enough to get a sense of how the Mohist argument is going to go. So there's a kind of criterion that they're applying here. They think basically if you have some policy issue that you want to discuss, like should we put on these extravagant musical performances in the court of the ruler, how do we assess that claim that you should put one on, right? That you should stage one of these events? And the answer is, well, you should do it as the benevolent person does, which is essentially to ask, does it maximize benefit for the world or does it minimize harm for them? So that's a kind of embrace of consequentialist justification. And I think I should add here, we haven't really discussed how elaborate these performances were, but the Mohists love to kind of revel in how opulent it is and how wasteful it is, how many resources are required. So expensive instruments that are really ornately carved, not just like nowadays people think of instruments, they think of, stringed instruments and so on, and maybe some drums, but there were these huge bells, that had to be cast. And they had these huge bell stands that were also, these great artisans would make those. Large ensembles, big dance performances. What we call music, what is being translated as music refers not just to the performance of sound harmonies and so on with musical instruments and singers, but dancers too. So it called for a lot of people just to perform them. And then, of course, everyone would stop what they're doing. They would drop their work, whether they were from the kind of social elite and that their work was necessary for running things, or whether they were laborers, farmers, peasants, that kind of thing. And they would drop their farming work and they would go attend these performances. So essentially, the chapter that I just read a little snippet from, The Condemnation of Musical Performances, suggests that the economic burdens are too great. In order to put on these performances, you have to tax the people, which diverts resources from food, clothing, defense. It often points out that the time and resources that are put into making these instruments could be better spent on boats and carts, right? Which are actually useful for people at getting food from one place to another and that kind of thing, or housing, right? So that's one burden, is the economic burden, but there are also opportunity costs. So if elites attend these performances, then they neglect governance, right? And if commoners attend, then they neglect their work. So those are missed opportunities to produce valuable goods. The chapter concludes, I think I will read a little bit of the conclusion of the chapter. This is why our teacher Mozi says, if men of rank and the gentlemen of the world really want to promote what is beneficial to the world and eliminate what is harmful to it, then they will prohibit and put an end to this thing called music. So that's how it concludes. Notice how, in a very sustained way, the text consistently applies what we think of as this consequentialist criterion. Does it bring about the most benefit possible and minimize harm as much as possible? And it reminds you again and again of that criterion. So it thinks on good consequentialist grounds, you just can't justify these musical performances.
Mm-hmm. So they are assuming that the Confucians would agree, at least, that, of course, they also want to benefit the world and eliminate what is harmful to it. And then the Mohists' argument is basically that, well, if you agree to that, then you'll have to prohibit or put an end to the musical performances because it's actually harmful. Yeah, which is interesting because I guess one tact, which we might talk about later, is that the Confucians might just reject that idea. They might say,
yeah,
no, we don't think that the ultimate goal is to bring about the best consequences.
Yes.
And
right.
So they could just reject that assumption.
Yeah, actually, that's right. So this text, this argument against musical performances, I don't know whether it's assuming that Confucians are on board with this consequentialist criterion, or anyway, it seems like the listener or the reader is supposed to be on board.
Mm-hmm.
And this is sort of a continuation of the point that you made earlier, Richard, about the implicit kind of egalitarianism in Mohism, egalitarianism about arguments. It seems like they're just saying this is common sense. There's another chapter in the Mozi where they say, if you want to look at what ways of life, what policies you should pursue, just look at what good members of families want for their families. They want certain benefits for their family, like they want a larger family, they want more kids, they want certain kinds of material goods like housing and so on. So anyway, they go on to say, and that's what a benevolent person should want for the world. So they're sort of extrapolating from the kind of implicit consequentialist calculation that you're making for your family and generalizing to the world more broadly. And they think that's common sense. So there is this notion that they're appealing to premises that we can all subscribe to. And you're right, the Confucians might deny those premises. I mean, we have some older episodes. We haven't yet decided what numbers they will be. But by the time you hear this, you'll probably have heard those episodes, or at least they'll be out, where Confucians like Mencius and the Mohists argue about impartial caring as a point of contention in this debate about consequentialism. So yeah, the Confucians might potentially reject that. I guess I want to mention one other thing about the Mohist argument that didn't come up in the stuff that I read, but is worth mentioning. There's this interesting moment in the chapter where Mozi says, he seems to be confessing, that there is at least some value in some sense, kind of small value, in the pleasure or joy that music brings. He says, I too admit that, seeing these beautiful instruments and hearing them delights my ears, or maybe another way of reading the passage is to say that, I admit that it delights the ears of the listener and so on. He seems to suggest that these aesthetic pleasures do have some value. It's just that it's trivial in comparison with the costs. The costs, of course, are things like food and shelter for the people, which are just far outweigh whatever value you get from the music itself. So it's not like he denies that music has any value. And for this reason, people have often said, scholars who've written on this issue, and there are a lot of scholars, I mean, it seems like Mozi isn't suggesting that people can't, sing, I don't know, as they work in the fields, to make it a little more bearable. or have family songs around the fireplace or what have you, or the campfire. So anyway, yeah, it's not exactly anti-music. It's just anti-musical performances.
Yeah, and the opportunity cost for sure of participating. Because, yeah, I mean, if you think about it, making those instruments would have been quite laborious, I would imagine. Back then, they got to do it by hand and they got to carve the instruments also. And the elaborate ceremonies would require all this time away from farming and would disrupt ordinary people's work. Yeah. And I guess another point that someone could make in favor of the Mohists would be, well, look, if you don't have food, and you starve to death, you can't even enjoy music because you'll die.
Yeah.
So I suppose they might say, yeah, isn't that a reason to think it's more fundamental, right? So maybe the Mohists might concede, yeah, if we had sufficient food for everybody and we didn't have any worries of that, of meeting basic needs, then let's get those ceremonies going. But so maybe I guess that does make the view a bit more, I think, plausible as well, if you think about it like that.
Yeah, exactly. So when I have taught classical Chinese philosophy, as I've done many times, I've been amazed to see again and again a certain pattern in my students, which is to say, after we contextualize and situate this argument against musical performances, and after we make it clear in class that it's not that the Mohists are against music altogether, they're just against these elaborate performances when they come at great cost to the basic needs of the people. Once you set it up that way, you'd think it'd be a very powerful argument. And yet, I've experienced again and again that most of my students find it drives them crazy, and they can't wait to explain why they think the argument is wrong, which has always been kind of remarkable to me. It's like suggests that somehow we have this kind of deep devotion, not just to music itself. I mean, obviously, most of us love music, but to this idea that music could be this kind of shared social enterprise, that it's not an extravagance to go to a concert, right, in a big group and to spend a lot of resources, even when resources are precious, and you don't have a lot to spare. So, yeah, I guess that's just a way of saying if patterns hold, then a lot of the listeners now are chomping at the bit to hear the Confucian response, which is what we're going to do next. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So we'll turn to Xunzi's defense of music here, and we're going to read a part of chapter 20, his discourse on music. So I'll read this passage. Music is joy, an unavoidable human disposition. So people cannot be without music. If they feel joy, they must express it in sound and give it shape in movement. The way of human beings is that changes in the motions of their nature are completely contained in these sounds and movements. So people cannot be without joy, and their joy cannot be without shape. But if it takes shape and does not accord with the way, then there will inevitably be chaos. The former kings hated such chaos, and therefore they established the sounds of the ya and the song in order to guide them. They caused the sounds to be enjoyable without becoming excessive. They caused the patterns to be recognizable without becoming degenerate. They caused the progression, complexity, intensity, and rhythm of the music to be sufficient to move the goodness in people's hearts. They caused perverse and corrupt qi to have no place to attach itself to them. This is the manner in which the former kings created music. And so what is Mozi doing denouncing it?
Yeah, so that's Eric Hutton's translation of the Discourse on Music from chapter 20 of the Xunzi. By the way, the earlier translation of the Mozi that we read was P.J. Ivanhoe's from Reading in Classical Chinese Philosophy. Right, so let's begin this rejoinder, this Confucian rejoinder to the Mohist argument. First of all, we'll just point out that Xunzi is making a kind of anthropological claim. He's making a claim about human beings in general or human nature, that joy and aesthetic expression are natural and universal, right? So it's unavoidable that people want to experience joy and that they'll want to express it in various ways. And he seems to suggest that it must be expressed in sound and given shape and movement, he says. So he's suggesting that musical sounds and dance, both of which are an essential part of these musical performances, are very natural ways of expressing joy. So how is this a response to the Mohist argument? Remember, the Mohist argument is basically focusing on the opportunity cost, the sacrifices that you must make in order to put on these big musical performances. You must give up important basic goods like food and shelter and clothing, carts and boats, stuff like that, in order to put on these musical performances. it seems like Xunzi would respond to that argument by saying, well, we might agree with that point that we have to give up valuable goods in order to put on these performances, but still, because this desire to express one's joy musically is so natural and so universal and so irrepressible, you can't repress it. This is a problem in some sense for human beings. It's going to come out one way or another, right? Music is joy, an unavoidable human disposition. So people cannot be without music. If they feel joy, they must express it in sound and give it shape in music. And he goes on to say, but there are some ways of expressing it that rapidly become degenerate so that they create chaos and so on. Yeah, so it seems like the argument here is, the response to the Mohists is essentially to invoke this basic claim about how human nature is and say that essentially we have to address this need to express our joy in healthy, pro-social ways that harmonize with others and so on, in ways that in some sense help to harmonize our inner dispositions for our own sake so that we're not expressing it in destructive ways. That's the beginning of his response anyway. Yeah.
And if we don't use a good channel to express deep part of us, then it's going to inevitably just kind of flow out in a kind of messy, chaotic manner and cause all kinds of harm. I suppose that's the idea. Like if you repress those deep natural feelings and emotions. Yeah, that's such an interesting idea. I don't know if I can think of any other like Western thinkers who thought of music like that. And maybe there have been, but who've had that conception of music as fundamental to sort of the human desires and the heart, and that needs to be somehow given expression in some way. Yeah, that's, I think, a really interesting kind of unique view.
Yes. I think in this case, Xunzi is articulating a view that was widespread among a large number of people in ancient China, especially the Confucians. Erica Brindley has a book on music in ancient China where she mentions some other texts, including some so-called excavated texts that have been lost to history until recently, and also the Analects of Confucius that articulate the same sentiment. And I liked your description, Richard, of Xunzi's view. He basically says we need channels to express our joy, and there are some channels which are kind of healthier and more harmonious than others. I think it's worth trying to fill in some of the details, some of the texture here, just so people can get a sense of how it's supposed to work. And for my purposes, it just so happens that I've been reading another Confucian musical treatise known as the Yueji, the Record of Music, with colleagues here at HKU. It's a nice glimpse into how Confucians thought of music. It's a very long treatise, and it even depicts Confucius at some points engaging in really fine-grained music analysis with his students. Like, his students will be asking, why do the drums go on for so long at the opening of this song? And like, why does the pace slow? Why does the rhythm slow here at this point, And so you get a sense of how it is that the Confucians in ancient times thought of the purposes of music. And what's clear from the kind of music analysis that you see Confucius and his students doing in that treatise is that there's a lot of concern with the objects of enjoyment in music. So one of the famous musical performances at the time apparently was about King Wu's conquest of China. King Wu was the one who founded the Zhou dynasty, overthrowing the unjust and tyrannical Shang dynasty. And it's very important that the music not celebrate violence for violence's sake, but if it's violence for some righteous cause, motivated by compassion, if it's done with a kind of sense of reluctance and remorse and so on, that's music that's worth celebrating. So you get the sense that the idea is through music, of course, you can't help but have certain bodily reactions to certain kinds of music. Fast-paced, drum beating and that kind of thing gets the blood boiling, And then, of course, when music soars, your heart soars in various ways. And when music falls, your heart falls. So this has a kind of physiological influence on us that then makes us feel in certain ways. It's important that we have the right associations with those feelings, There's also apparently in ancient China, there was the so-called Zheng music, Z-H-E-N-G, which was licentious. It seemed to celebrate lusty things like sex and power, and most Confucians condemned that. So you get some sense of the kind of worries that Xunzi might have just from looking at these other texts. His worry seems to be that if you listen to music that seems to make you think a lot about and thus appreciate and admire conquest, power, sex, violence for violence's sake, that's problematic. So yeah, I think that perhaps gives people a sense of what sorts of expressions of joy he thinks are more lend themselves to the kind of chaos that he's worried about.
Yeah, so still, the Confucians are very much focused on the connection between music and also one's character and also the broader kind of common good. And so, what's good for society, what harmonizes society, and so on. And yeah, I suppose it's a really debated issue today, right? I'm not sure what
Yeah.
most people would say now, like what musical theorists think today. Do they agree that like violent music does have this kind of
Yeah.
destructive consequence for people's minds? And really easily, I could see how it could have that kind of power. I mean, I know some people argue that like, oh, like violent video games aren't actually that destructive, although it's hard because people seem to give different kinds of evidence for both different or divergent views. And so I'm not sure if there's been like a lot of empirical research done on the practical consequences of different forms of music. I wonder if that's been done. Are you aware of any of that kind of psychological studies? That'd be really interesting to know about.
Yeah, absolutely. I myself haven't written on music in the Confucian tradition, but for some reason it's a very popular topic among scholars nowadays. So I'm just thinking of colleagues who've written really compellingly on it. And one thing that some of them do rather well, Erica Brindley, whom I mentioned earlier, does this well. PJ Ivanhoe has a chapter on music in his book, Confucian Reflections. They're sort of mindful of the fact that they're addressing an audience that tends to be sort of skeptical about these claims about the power of music, precisely because we grew up in an era, at least in the West, when people are really worried about overzealous censorship on the part of government. And one of the ways in which governments have justified censorship of music is by saying, well, listening to violent hip hop will make people violent or, what have you. And that's been greeted with a lot of skepticism because it's, you don't see tremendous outbreaks of violence among people who listen to certain kinds of music. And I have to say, there's a kind of, so if you read Xunzi with that mindset, there's a temptation to say that he's attributing too much transformative power to music, because it looks like he really believes that these musical performances, especially when they're done collectively, when people are listening to music together, will kind of unify everyone's emotional dispositions and get them all kind of rallying around the same moral exemplars and, the same ideals and so on. And a lot of people read that and say, really? That's just doesn't seem very realistic, doesn't seem very plausible. But I still think that people like Brindley and Ivanhoe have really clever ways of making it more plausible. So I guess we could put it this way. The very strongest argument for Xunzi is something like, music is capable of completely transforming character. But there's still a weaker argument available to us that would still succeed in responding to the Mohists, which is to say, okay, maybe it's not completely transformative. Maybe it doesn't do all the work or even a lot of the work of moral transformation. But still, it is so much more effective when you compare it with the other means of modifying and changing our character. So like, what are the other candidates if you think about it, right? Let's say you want people to be less quick to anger and less kind of so obsessed with their own personal honor so that they can get along with others, so that every disagreement doesn't break out in a fight. So how can you encourage people to be that way, to be less quick to anger? Give them arguments? It seems to me like that's not exactly going to succeed, That seems to be sort of implicitly what the Mohists are assuming, is that just like the power of a good argument is going to do the work. Another option is to like have them read histories. I mean, I love reading history, but I'm not sure it's that effective at transforming people's character. Now, there's another option, which is to say, how about reading like short stories or novels, right? I think that actually is quite effective at reshaping one's emotional temperament. Like once you've really seen inside someone's worldview and like say someone who's experienced some tragedy, that can really shape you in a lasting way. It can sort of have a lasting effect on your sense of right and wrong and what have you. But even so, it takes a lot of work to read a short story or a novel, and not many people will do it, and it works more slowly. By comparison, music goes deep and it's very quick. The effect of music is very quick. And thus, it's much more widely available. You don't have to just count on people finishing a novel in order for it to take effect. There's another line in the Xunzi. He says, sounds and music enter into people deeply and transform people quickly. I think he's just saying, compared to other methods of moral cultivation, it goes much deeper and it's much quicker. And for that reason, it's sort of the best of the available methods for moral cultivation. I don't know. I find when you frame it that way as the best of the available methods, it is quite powerful. I mean, just reflecting on my own life, it seems like it's just true that music is more evocative, that it takes effect much more quickly and in a more lasting way than other ways of trying to change our temperaments.
Yeah, it does seem like the power of music is even more clear when you couple it with maybe another medium. I watched Les Miserables with my wife. It's this incredible Broadway
Mm,
musical. And of course, it's anchored in this novel by Victor Hugo, which is
yeah.
also a beautiful book that I think I've mentioned before.
Yeah.
But
I love it. Yeah.
yeah, and the story and the narrative is extremely powerful. But when you watch the musical, it's powerful in another way, and partly because of the songs. Like
Yeah.
when the people is fighting in the revolution, and there's this beautiful score that is so well sung and is so inspiring. And yeah, I think of like John Williams' Star Wars, right? I mean, imagine watching that movie without any of the music. It
Right.
would be
Yeah.
so different and obviously so much worse. It might not be as memorable, like, when Darth Vader comes marching in, or when there's a kind of a heroic sacrifice and there's a certain form of music that often takes place, right? And it does create in our minds a deeper memory, and I think can really move us. I think that's so clear. So,
Yeah.
yeah, all that is to say, I think maybe the weaker
That's
argument
true.
seems highly plausible. It seems like definitely there's more power. And maybe the strong argument that you noted earlier about, oh, it just completely transforms you on its own. Yeah, maybe that's too strong. But maybe there's like middle level argument. I actually think there might be more power to music than we might understand now. I don't think we
Yeah.
fully grasp it, actually.
Yeah. I remember Ivanhoe makes a good example of the singing of We Shall Overcome by the early civil rights activists, the one who's so heroically facing major threats and death
Hmm.
to bring the vote to people who couldn't vote in the South. I'm moved to tears when I think about that. And I can imagine that that song did fortify people. And singing it together, by the way,
Yes.
fortified people. That actually reminds me of another argument that we hadn't even mentioned yet that comes from the Xunzi. Xunzi thinks it's really important when these performances take place that people see them together, that they appreciate them together, that they're like, joining together as a community and listening to the music. He thinks that creates a kind of camaraderie and sense of solidarity in the audience.
Mhm.
And I have to say, there too, I think his view is not far-fetched. My experience all my life has been that when someone is really excited about music, they want other people to like it too.
Mhm.
And that when you go to a live show, as I still do quite often, you feel a kind of spiritual unity or camaraderie with the other people at the concert. You love it that other people love the music as much as you do. So Xunzi, we didn't want to read too much Xunzi, but he explains that also is an important function of music, is that sense of social solidarity.
Social bonding and trust. And yeah, there's
Yeah,
a kind of like this socially embodied memory that forms. And I think, yeah, that has actually enduring power. And yeah, if you look at religious ceremonies, but also like graduation ceremonies or different weddings, there are certain forms of music that come on that is actually quite evocative and, as you noted, and extremely
yeah,
powerful. And if those were missing, it would be a very different experience.
yeah, that's right. Well, some of you may have noticed about Xunzi's response is that it seems like he's, in some sense, accepting the Moist challenge on the Moist terms. So the Moists are saying something like this as I read them. Maybe listening to music itself has some intrinsic value, but the intrinsic value is pales in comparison. It's far outweighed by the countervailing sacrifices that you have to make in basic goods like people's labor and carts and boats and food and housing and so on. So it seems like Xunzi is trying to show that no, in fact, there are these good effects that could be had by performing music. And one of those good effects, of course, is the social solidarity we just discussed. Another one is that it changes the temperament. It helps rein in these unruly emotions and tames them and makes them more harmonious and makes them healthier, both for the community and also for the individual, him or herself. And those are all kind of instrumental, I think, justifications. You might wonder, did anyone ever just defend the view that like enjoying the music itself is so valuable intrinsically, independently of whatever effects it brings about, that it's worth it, right? And the answer is, of course someone did. I mean, this is, how could it not occur to people that would be a justification worth exploring? And so we looked around for one way of examining that kind of appeal to the intrinsic value of music. And one of the coolest passages actually comes from a lesser known chapter of the Mozi. It's chapter 48, known as the Gongmeng chapter. It basically depicts Mozi engaged in debates with Confucians. So here's the chapter where we see them debating whether this appeal to the intrinsic value of listening to music and appreciating music is going to run, whether it's going to be an adequate justification. All right, so this is chapter 48, the Gongmeng chapter. Mozi asked a Confucian, "What reason is there for performing music?" Now, by the way, we don't know which Confucian this is. That Confucian is not named. The reply was, "Music is performed for music's sake." Yeah, yu wei yeah. It's the Chinese. So that word music is a translation of this character, yeah. We'll have more to say about that shortly. So basically, the Confucian has replied, music is performed for music's sake. Okay. Mozi said, "You have not yet answered my question. Suppose I ask you, what is the reason for building houses? And you answer, to keep off the cold in the winter, the heat in the summer, and to separate men and women. Then you have told me the reason for building houses. Now I am asking you, what reason is there for performing music? And you answer, music is performed for music's sake." This is like me asking, what is the reason for building houses? And you answering, houses are built for houses' sake. And that's a slight modification, W.P. May's translation of this chapter. Okay, so it seems like the unnamed Confucian is suggesting that music is, in some sense, the good itself that makes the performance of music, including these big public performances, worth the while. And you don't necessarily need to appeal to some other additional good in order to justify it. So it's a final or non-instrumental, or some people say intrinsic good. I just want to add one thing that came up when I looked at my favorite commentator to the Mozi. His name is Sun Yirang, the Qing Dynasty commentator, really astute and clever. One thing that everyone who reads Chinese knows is that the word that is translated as music is the same character visually as the character that is translated as joy. So earlier we had this passage where Xunzi said, music is joy. He's using the same character twice. So in modern Chinese, modern Mandarin, the yue, the yin yue de yue, is the same as le, kuai le de le. So it's pronounced differently when you're referring to music as opposed to when you're referring to joy, but it's the same character. Now, Sun Yirang, this Qing Dynasty commentator, points out, or at least he argues, they were pronounced the same way in ancient times. So when the Confucian responds to Mozi that music is performed for music's sake, what he's actually saying is something like music is performed for the sake of musical joy, or the joy you take in music, or something like that. And his reading, by the way, is not that Mozi is confused about what the Confucian is arguing. He thinks Mozi understands him perfectly well. So it seems like, at least on Sun Yirang, this Qing Dynasty commentator's interpretation, Mozi is acknowledging that there is some joy in music, in these musical performances. But he still thinks the justification falls short because it doesn't appeal to the kinds of basic goods that he thinks are necessary in order to justify a policy. He says, if I were to ask you, what are houses built for? Why do we build houses? And the answer is, well, because it keeps out the cold in the winter, keeps out the heat in the summer, and it separates men and women. Apparently that was an important function of houses. Then he says, you've given me the kind of justification I can get behind. But he doesn't feel like the joy of music itself suffices for that kind of justification. So there's sort of two interpretations of this passage. One is to say that Mozi just kind of stubbornly insists on an instrumental justification for music. He thinks that music can't be intrinsically justified. The other one is to say that maybe he recognizes that there is some intrinsic joy in music. It's just that intrinsic joy doesn't count as a justification. It's not the kind of good he's concerned with. He's a utilitarian in that other sense I mentioned earlier, right? He's concerned with functional goods, goods that meet basic needs we can all get behind and we all see the value of. And this weird abstract thing, joy, just doesn't cut it, doesn't suffice.
Yeah, so it is strange if we interpret him as rejecting joy as a good justification or reason. That is pretty striking. I mean, what's interesting is, yeah, in that way, he's like not a utilitarian at all in the philosophical sense, because philosophical utilitarians ultimately think that pleasure is the only good.
That's right. Or there's the version of utilitarianism that says the good is well-being, which might be pleasure, it might be desire satisfaction, whatever you take well-being to be, essentially.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of maybe the classical utilitarians,
Yes.
certainly like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. They thought that pleasure, I guess they also used the term happiness, but I think by happiness, they really meant pleasure.
Yeah,
They
that's
think
right.
that that really is the ultimate good. Whereas
Yeah, that's
Mozi,
true.
at least on this one interpretation, we have him denying that that's really even a good reason at all, which is very interesting. Yeah, so I really like this passage a lot. And that was something that always crossed my mind. Like Xunzi, he is offering various kinds of instrumental justifications. But we do think that there's all these important goods like music or beauty. I guess that's connected to friendship, love, maybe knowledge, even virtue, moral goodness. These things are valuable for their own sake. And if you start trying to justify why you should have friends at all, it starts looking bad. So someone says like, "Oh, why are you going to hang out with your friend?" And what are you expected to say? Well, my friend, he might get me a better job, or
Yeah.
he's loaded. He might give me some money down the road. So as soon as you start trying to justify it, it seems like you're trying to offer the wrong kind of reasons for those kinds of things that we just think are what we might say constituents of a flourishing life. They're just internal to a really happy, good life. And they're not good for the sake of a further end. So, yeah, I guess I would think music is very plausibly one of those intrinsic or non-instrumentally valuable goods.
Yeah, Richard, I was thinking that there might even be an implicit appeal to an intuition, which I know because I know your views and your work would resonate with you. And that is essentially that when it comes to the good life and it comes to goods that are really worth pursuing, there's a difference in the quality of those goods. So sometimes in the scholarship on well-being, for example, people will make a distinction between kinds of pleasure. They'll say, this pleasure in good things like, I don't know, very good art or good music or helping others. That's a good kind of pleasure. But the pleasure of the sadistic torturer, someone who takes pleasure in torturing others and hurting and harming others, that's not a good kind of pleasure to pursue. It could be that one of the things the Confucian in this dialogue is appealing to is this intuition that it's not just joy, it's the joy that you take in music in particular. Good music, like this exemplary music that the Confucians recommend. That's the kind of joy that's like refined. You have these like moral exemplars that are worth admiring. It's complex harmonies compared with beautiful dancing and all that kind of stuff. That's a pleasure truly worth admiring.
Right. So I think that pleasure's value is holistic in nature. So I subscribe to a view that might be called something like contextualism about the value of pleasure. What that means is the value of pleasure is context-based. So not all pleasures or not every instances of pleasurable experience, even though we might like them or they might be a positive experience, are necessarily even good for us. So yeah, I think you came up with the example of like, well, what about a sadistic torturer's pleasure or schadenfreude, right? So you take pleasure at the suffering of someone. Yeah, I actually just don't think that those are pleasures that are good for us. I think the value of pleasure is not there, or the value of pleasure does depend on the kind of pleasure it is or the kind of object it's attached to.
Yeah.
And pain too, actually. I think pain would be kind of another interesting, I guess, debatable issue, but I think certain forms of pain might not necessarily be bad for us, like grief when you really lost someone that you love. I wouldn't push a button to just simply immediately let that go away, even though it's a painful experience. So grief, for example, would be one of those. Or, people run marathons and there's a kind of pain involved. I mean, would you really want there to be no pain at all in those kinds of experiences? If you could push a button and could get rid of all the pain and just run the marathon, I mean, at the very least, a lot of people would not push that button. And so I think pain and pleasure are enormously complicated topics, definitely from a philosophical perspective. And the value of pain and pleasure is very difficult to assess. But yeah, I mean, I know some people just think pain is always bad and pleasure is always good, no matter what kind. But at least I don't subscribe to that. And I don't think the Confucians would have either.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So it's always tempting And a younger version of myself would have succumbed to this temptation to defend the simple pleasure and pain view, the non-contextual, non-holistic view, by saying, well, the problem with the sadistic torture or the Schadenfreude is that the total amount of pain or pleasure that across the population is lower if you have a bunch of sadistic torturers who really enjoy. So it's in terms of like the net benefit or cost, it's we're better off without people.
Although one point there is if enough people enjoy it, if enough people at the Colosseum get pleasure out of seeing the person getting eaten by the lion, then it sounds like even the net pleasure comes out in a positive direction. And so therefore, the Christian being fed to the lion was a good thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, so as someone who hasn't planted a flag in this particular debate, I just don't participate actively in these debates about the nature of well-being. But someone who reads a lot about it, I read all the stuff that you've written and your interlocutors, Richard. I got to say, like, as I get older, I've learned to distrust that part of me that is tempted by theoretical elegance. That is like really simple, systematic theories that kind of neatly sum up some good, for example, reduce all kinds of good to one type or something like that. That's an example of theoretical elegance. I realize now I have to overcome that particular attachment, and the better explanation for the fact that it seems like some pleasures and some pains really are, in certain contexts, better or worse than others, is just that they actually are. And so anyway, I'm tempted to agree with you. Okay, so, well, anyway, I think your view articulates a sentiment which coheres well with the Confucian one, and may have been the one that this unnamed Confucian that's debating with Mozi had in mind, but we'll never know for sure. I think it's worth now kind of taking a step back and asking, what are the takeaways from this debate? So the debate takes place in historical context, which might be tempted to think is no longer relevant. So Mozi seems to be speaking to audiences that share his assumption that when you put on a big musical performance, that comes at the cost of essential goods like boats, carts, housing, and so on, that surely most people agree are very, very important. Nowadays, many of us can attend a concert without necessarily sacrificing housing and food, right? But I still think the debate can reemerge in various ways that would still elicit strong Mohist or Confucian loyalties and intuitions. So, for example, I know that we have this plan to interview Daniel Bell about his forthcoming book, which depicts classical Confucian political thinkers engaging in debates about modern topics. And one of the debates is about whether to build a community arts center. And he has the Mohists arguing against the author of the Yueji, that the record of music that I mentioned earlier. The Confucian author of the Yueji, unnamed, defends building community cultural centers for the arts. And Mozi continues to think it's a waste of resources, at least insofar as in order to build these centers, you have to tax people, right? That's a controversy that's still very much alive today, whether it's worth taxing people for museums and art centers and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. I mean, those can be costly and cost millions of dollars to build really good museums, right? Art galleries, even like public parks, playgrounds. And that money could have been used to feed more people,
right?
Especially if you're willing to take that money and donate it internationally. Then you have a kind of argument that someone like Peter Singer would advocate.
Yes,
where
right.
Let's say that $10 million to create that children's museum, that could have gone to like a really impoverished area in a developing part of the world and could have fed kids that are starving. And
right.
I guess, and there's no clear, straightforward answer there because, I mean, starving children, that is a terrible tragedy. And so I suppose the Mohists would have said, even today, if they had come back to be alive, they would say, hey, you shouldn't build an art gallery when you can feed like 10,000 kids. That makes no sense. It's obvious that that's wrong.
Yes, right. Yeah. And I feel the pull of that claim. I admire it in some ways. Now, that's another issue that comes up sometimes in these debates between Confucians and Mohists. I think you've made it clear. So this idea that maybe the money would be better spent on feeding famine victims or starving kids in a foreign country, that appeals to a kind of cosmopolitan view, according to which everyone, regardless of their citizenship, their interests make some claim on us. And whether we happen to be fellow citizens or not shouldn't matter, at least with respect to those kind of life or death situations like famine. And there too, Confucians, I think, are pretty clear that actually that's not a view that they can get on board with. They are advocates of partial caring, usually envisioned as a kind of series of concentric circles where the interests of the people that you care about most are your immediate family members, then maybe your close friends, maybe community members or more distant family members, and so on. And somewhere in the series of concentric circles is a circle for members of your own state or country. Those people get higher priority than just sort of citizens of the world or people in other countries. Yeah, it's hard to shake that Confucian view, I have to say. It's certainly more natural. And it would be hard to live completely at home with a moral framework that treated everyone's claims on us as counting exactly the same way. So that's a kind of interesting debate, which we actually do address at great length in 2 other episodes. One on the Mohists' defense of impartial caring, and another one on the criticisms of impartial caring that come from Mencius. And we'll be sure to refer to those in the show notes. We'll put a link in
Yeah, and
the
I
show.
suppose the Mohists might say that it's understandable to give some partial care. I mean, they might reject this view, but it's understandable at least to give some partial care for your own, let's say, family members to make sure they're not starving. But once their basic needs are met, like let's say they have food and shelter and clothing, then to say that even the extra money you have should go to then to develop finer tastes and indulge in like music or art instead of going to, let's say, someone outside of your immediate circle or feeding people outside of your immediate circle. I suppose the Mohists might say, hey, but doesn't that look even less morally appealing? I mean, It's understandable if you privilege your family to feed them first, but you're saying that even after you feed them and you have more money, you would still keep pouring in more money to your own family.
Yeah.
And I think they find that problematic. And I think that's a serious moral challenge, actually.
Yeah, I do too. Not easily dealt with. That's right. But maybe it's okay to point our listeners to the other episodes where we discuss these issues further. And I myself feel like there's much more to say about the status of musical joy, the appreciation of music as an intrinsic good. I hope at least that we've given everyone a sense of the kind of complexity of this debate and how wide-ranging it is. And also how important it is, how central it is to the identities of Mohists and Confucians in their historical context. You can see how it makes salient, how it puts a microscope, in some sense, on the core commitments of both Confucians and Mohists. And you can see how the contentious issues in their own time can carry over in some ways to contentious issues today. So I guess we'll say that that's it for today. That was the way for today. 感谢你的收听. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.